I think it's pretty solid advice.
Groups of cells in different parts of your brain, they're all connected.
The statistics just don't back it up. There's nothing here.
Any complex life you find has mitochondria.
We have discovered things from athletes juicing.
My name is Matt Kaberlein, and welcome to the Optispan podcast. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Optispan podcast. Today, we are going to talk about a study that looks at the effects of nicotinamide mononucleotide on VO2 Max. And this really came from a video that we recorded a few weeks ago where we reacted to a video that Greg Doucette put out on his perception of the inaccuracies in DEXA and how his Superman X-ray vision was better than the DEXA machine at measuring body composition. But as part of that, it came out that Greg Doucette sells a supplement called VO2 Max, which includes NMN, with the claim that it improves VO2 Max, and it cites this study that we're going to talk about today. And again, I don't really want this to be targeted at Greg Doucette. There are lots of other people out there selling NMN and making claims about endurance exercise and exercise performance, really, as far as I can tell, based pretty much solely on this one human study. So I thought it might be interesting to do a little bit of a deeper dive and look into this. And you've got a lot of expertise in measuring VO2 max. And so I think we can just kind of talk through what this study shows and what it doesn't show. So VO2 Max, tell us a little bit about this supplement.
Yeah, so I've watched plenty of Greg Doucette videos, and he pushes this pretty hard. Almost every video he'll mention this. And he's even talked about the amount of money he's made from it, and it's a substantial amount. There's the whole legality thing too, of like NMN being the sort of gray zone. He's Canadian, so I'm not sure how that.
Yeah, right. Things. So the situation, as I understand it, is that so NMN is an NAD precursor, just like nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide, niacin. It's found in our bodies, and if taken at sufficient doses, seems able to increase NAD levels, at least in some tissues and in circulation, right? Mm-hmm. Worth, I think, just stating, we've covered NAD precursors and NMN multiple times on the podcast. There's an episode with Charlie Brenner, an episode with George Sutphin, actually with George, where we get into some of the details of the biosynthetic pathway. So people are really interested in that. I'd refer people to those videos. I think it's probably worth just saying that the current literature seems to suggest that NMN and NR, so nicotinamide mononucleotide, nicotinamide riboside, get broken down into niacin in the gut, get taken up that way, get resynthesized into NAD in our bodies. That's just to say that my expectation is any of these NAD precursors, what's true for one will be true for all if you can achieve appropriate dosing from oral delivery. Okay. So if it's true for NMN, it's probably true for NR, probably true for nicotinamide, probably true for niacin. No real reason to think that they're going to be unique in that way. So NMN, though, is currently in this sort of limbo because of an FDA ruling. And this ruling was, preliminary ruling was made in part because of a challenge that a company called Metro Biotech made against the sale of NMN over the counter, because Metro wants to develop this as a pharmaceutical drug. Scientifically, there's no basis to that. It's ridiculous. NMN is no different, as I've already said, from NR, niacin, nicotinamide. If one is sold over the counter, they all should be. But FDA has sort of made this preliminary ruling that NMN should be treated as a drug. Technically, that means companies should not be selling it. Some people are. I don't think it's illegal, but I don't know for sure. And I don't know if Greg being from Canada has anything to do with that.
Not sure. So what he's selling from his company is it's got vitamin B9, B12, it's got sodium, it's got NMN at 400 milligrams. We'll come back to that dose later. It's got a couple other things, so black pepper extract. There's something called ancient peat and apple extract, which I haven't heard of before.
What makes it ancient?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important to say that this research, and I believe it's in their opening sort of their abstract, they said that they felt like there was a gap in the literature, so there's no human clinical trials analyzing the effects of NMN combined with exercise zones.
Right.
So that's what the problem they were trying to solve for.
Right. And so the paper is published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. It's titled Nicotinamide Mononucleotide Supplementation Enhances Aerobic Capacity in Amateur Runners, a randomized double-blind study. And it comes from a group of authors from the Department of Sports Medicine at Guangzhou Sport University in Guangzhou, China. I want to be a little bit careful how I say this. So I spent about 4 years as a distinguished visiting professor at Guangdong Medical College in Dongguan, China. So I know the scientific community and system in China pretty well, certainly by American standards, I would say very well. And I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of papers from smaller universities or universities that don't have the same reputation or have a high reputation that in China than I do scientific papers in general. And that's not at all meant as in questioning the integrity or honesty of scientists at those institutions. It more reflects my experience and perception that the training that scientists at some of these less known universities receive is often not to the same level in terms of scientific methodology and rigor as what you would typically get at institutions in the United States or in many countries in Europe. And I also want to say the top institutions in China are on par with the top institutions anywhere else in the world. So this is not a China thing, but I think because the scientific enterprise in China has grown very, very rapidly, and the allocation of large amounts of resources to biomedical research in China is relatively new, you have a pretty rapid drop-off in training once you get outside of a few top institutions, typically in Beijing or Shanghai, although not exclusively. There's a pretty fast drop-off that you don't necessarily see in other places where biomedical research has a much longer history of being supported at a high level. And so that just makes me a little bit more skeptical, and I tend to take a much closer look at the design of the study. This is not saying anything specific about this study. I do think it is useful for people to appreciate that. And it is a reality that many of the leading investigators at these higher profile Chinese institutions came to the United States or places in Europe, got their graduate or postdoctoral training there, and have now gone back to China. And so you're starting to get this training in modern scientific methodology going back to China. So anyways, I think it is worth mentioning because we have seen in the last decade a dramatic increase in papers coming out of China. And it's just a fact, at least in my opinion, that it's a little bit more uneven.
Okay, makes sense. All right, so I want to talk about the methods real quick. So it's sort of the study design. So there was 48 trained runners, so the participants. 40 were male, 8 were female. They were aged 27 to 50. They regularly exercised for at least 1 to 5 years prior to the study. They were part of the Pearl River running team. So there's 4 groups. So there's the low dosage, 300 milligrams a day. So they did 150 twice a day. Medium dose, 600 milligrams a day. High dose, 1,200 milligrams a day. Again, split 600, 600. And there's a control group, placebo. And then each group had 10 male and 2 female participants. So any thoughts on that sort of the methods study design?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the positives, right, it is a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. They're trying to do it to the highest standards of rigor, so I give them credit for that. I think the group sizes are too small, clearly too small for a well-powered study. I mean, again, I don't think they did a power calculation, but if they did, the group sizes are too small. You know, when you're starting with 48 and you have 4 different groups, that leaves you with 12 people per group. Again, that's just not going to be statistically powered to see anything unless the effect size is huge. So I think the authors would agree, you know, you'd much rather have a much larger study, but sometimes that's the best you can do.
Yeah, and they said in limitations that they not many women participants as well.
Right. And I do like the fact that they tried to balance the men and the women across groups. That's a good design.
Yeah, so they worked out. So for the 6-week study, they did a baseline. So they did a cardiopulmonary exercise testing program at the beginning, and they did one at the end. So sort of testing VO2 max and the different sort of thresholds. So 6 weeks long, they did run and bike. They had to bike, I believe, at least one time a week. They're able to run the other 4 to 5. 40 to 60-minute sessions, 5 to 6 times per week. They wanted to keep their heart rate 80 to 100% of their ventilatory threshold 1, which we'll kind of go into later. And they had to sort of ramp up. So each week got harder. So their threshold, their percent went from 80 to 90, 100. So they went up.
Yeah. And this, again, seems to be a pretty well-designed study. Like they had specific metrics that they wanted each participant to hit, and presumably pre-designed approach for how they were going to ramp up the intensity of the exercise.
So they did some body composition and they got some other data like grip strength. So they used a bioelectrical impedance scale, which we talked about on our first DEXA episode.
Yeah.
They did BMI, body fat percent, fat-free mass, grip strength, push-ups, and single leg balance. And it's a bit of a spoiler here, but the body comp data was inconclusive / insignificant, and it could be because the tool was maybe underpowered.
Yeah, I think, again, as we've sort of talked about before, these impedance scales are not as accurate as DEXA, especially depending on what type of device they used. So you probably would have wanted to use DEXA if you really wanted to have a chance at seeing any change in body composition. Really no change, though, in weight or BMI. And what I think is also interesting is no changes in strength as measured by grip strength or push-ups. So, if there was any effect of NMN, it certainly didn't seem to have a big effect on strength performance. Again, that wasn't the primary goal of this study, and it's probably worth emphasizing. The primary goal of this study was to detect to ask whether or not NMN could improve VO2 max. That's what they really were looking for here. So this is sort of what you would call a secondary endpoints, looking at, other things that might change. And so no evidence for change could be because it was underpowered, could be because NMN doesn't have any effect on these things.
Makes sense. So for the, cardiopulmonary endurance performance, essentially a VO2 max test. So, I probably do 3 a week, here at Optispan. So it's pretty important choosing the right workload. So they did it on a bike. For men, they started at 50 to 100 watts and they ramped up 20 to 30 watts per minute. For women, they started at 50 to 75 watts and ramped up 15 to 25 watts per minute. So if they're doing mostly running, this is a running club. When you do it on a bike, I think the literature shows about a 10 to 20% decrease in your overall number.
Okay.
So if you're 50, you might go down to 45 to 40, depending.
Yeah, it's hard to say whether that's a problem with the study. Again, if you wanted a true measure of VO2 max, right, you'd want to do it in a way that's going to give you the max value, right?
Yeah.
So from that perspective, maybe that is a limitation to the study. If NMN was really affecting VO2 max, you would probably expect to see a change, even given the way they did it. But so it's hard for me to know whether that's a really likely to affect the outcome of the study or a problem with the way the study was done. At least we can say they did it the same for everybody, which is probably most important. Yeah,
it's a bit of an art of ramping someone up. If you go too quick, their legs burn out before their cardio system does, or cardiorespiratory system. If you go too slow, they might pre-fatigue. So you want the test to end in around 15 minutes or so, and you want them to get within 10 beats of their theoretical heart rate max. So if you're 20 years old, you're 220 minus 8, so your heart rate max would be 200.
Yeah.
So you'd have to hit at least 190 for that to be an accurate VO2 max test.
Yeah. Did you see anything in the paper that makes you think that the data they got was not accurate?
No, they got good data.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So let's talk about the results. So again, the goal of this paper was to assess whether or not NMN can improve VO2 max. The answer is there was no evidence for change in VO2 max. No statistically significant difference in any of the NMN groups compared to the placebo. So it did not seem to have an effect. I don't even think there was a trend. So I think, again, it's hard to say with confidence from a negative result that means NMN doesn't affect VO2 max. We can't really say that. No evidence here to suggest that it does. What they did see were what seemed pretty significant changes and potentially dose-dependent changes in the ventilatory thresholds, especially VT1. So VT1 seemed to move in a direction as if NMN was improving this threshold. So maybe you want to take a minute and explain what VT1 is, and then we can talk about, what that might mean in terms of NMN.
So there's two ventilatory thresholds. There's VT1, VT2. So VT1 is the same if you heard people talk about like anaerobic threshold or zone 2 threshold. They're saying the same thing. This is the point during exercise where breathing starts to sort of increase. You start to use more oxygen. Lactate begins to accumulate in the blood more, but the body can still manage it. It can clear it off efficiently. So exercise at this level can be done for long periods. So this would be like if you do like an 8-hour hike, you're mostly below VT1 around there.
And how do you measure the transition point from 1 to 2?
The gold standard would be lactate testing. So blood lactate levels above 2 millimolar would be going from VT1
But
to
they didn't
VT2.
measure lactate here.
No, they did not.
So how did they measure this transition?
They do other ones, which is heart rate. So a percent of your heart rate max. So if you know your heart rate max, VT1 usually, I don't want to get the number wrong, it's around 60% or so.
But that's going to be, I would guess, somewhat individual, right?
Exactly.
I mean, again, if lactate is the defining measure, is it the case that every person shows this change in lactate at the same percent of their max heart rate? I mean, the answer is no. I mean, it's sort of
It'll be different. Yeah. Depending on
so that's
level.
really not a good way to measure VT1.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it's not the gold standard way to measure.
Completely agree. Yeah. And I know that Katia has popularized the talk method where if you and I are on a treadmill next to each other and we can talk, we're probably...
These are all estimates, though.
They're
right?
estimates, yeah, but they didn't do the gold standard.
Okay, all right.
And then just talk about real quick the second ventilatory threshold. So this occurs at a higher intensity of exercise when lactate accumulates more rapidly and the body can no longer clear it efficiently. So this leads to a sharp increase in breathing rate. So EPOC, your body's trying to get in a lot more oxygen. And then a rapid increase in blood lactate levels. You get also an increase in hydrogen ions, which causes that sort of burning feeling. So when I used to run in track and field, I did the 400 meters. My best time was 51 seconds. I'm in this zone where I am, I can't bring in enough oxygen to keep up with the workload from my legs. So eventually you're going to fail.
Okay. And so what they reported was a dose-dependent significant improvement in VT1 with NMN supplementation and no change in VO2 max.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of exercise performance, what might we expect that to, let's just assume that's true for a minute. What might we expect that to mean for the average person?
To me, it would help someone doing longer distance, longer time duration events. Maybe they can stay within their zone 2 threshold for a longer period before they go into that next level where they start to burn more glycogen, carbohydrates as fuel.
And so if you were doing like a marathon or, some longer ultra marathon kind of event, you might expect to see an improvement in performance in that context.
Exactly. Yeah. What I don't see is I think there's, again, I'm kind of speaking speculative, but I'm pretty sure when you have the Tour de France winners, the top guys have the highest VO2 max. People who perform less well have a lower VO2 max. So in terms of, I can't see a practical application of, without actually increasing your VO2 max, how it would help you maybe in competitive environment.
Okay. So that's pretty much the study. I mean, there wasn't really much more to it. I think, the question I've got, so I think the thing that I would have liked to see would be some assessments of actual performance, right? So how far can they run? How fast can they run? Does it actually impact that? That wasn't in this study. I'm interested to know. I think most people would be interested to know. And that's how these supplements are being marketed, right? That NMN is going to help improve your performance. So that was missing from this study. I think as we've already talked about, they didn't see a change in VO2 max, which was the goal. And the way they measured VT1 probably wasn't exactly the way you would want to do it if you were going to try to do the very best assessment that you can. Not clear to me why they didn't measure lactate. That's pretty easy. I think almost anybody should have had the ability to do that. So I think my take home is I think there's something here. Like I believe, also given that if NMN is actually boosting NAD levels, particularly in the liver, I believe that there's likely to be some potential effects from NAD boosting on this VT1, right? This transition to sort of zone 2. You could imagine that has to do with energy production by mitochondria, oxidative phosphorylation, right? So it's plausible. I I don't know if that translates into anything meaningful for people in terms of performance or benefit from exercise. Completely unclear, I think, at this point. And the question I've got is, this paper was published in 2021. That's 3 years ago now. Why, if NMN really does boost exercise performance, why don't we actually have data showing that? Like, that's really easy to show. I'm sure people have done these studies. Why hasn't this been demonstrably shown?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, again, maybe nobody's done the study properly or with enough individuals, but I would expect if there were real robust effects, we would know it by now.
Yeah. And there are things out there like carnitine and ITTP that have been shown to increase VO2 max, and they're banned by anti-doping agencies. So it's sort of something to think about.
Yeah, again, and I don't know how these anti-doping agencies work and whether they would ban something before having strong evidence that it actually works. I don't know what to read into that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of funny because I've heard people say, like, oh, but the Patriots were taking NMN, right? They had all their players taking NMN, and I'm like, yeah, the Patriots haven't been very good for a little while, so I don't know that I would use that as evidence that NMN really boosts any sort of physical prowess.
Yeah.
But again, who knows?
Sure, they all take creatine, which is fine. So.
So again, I think this, this is sort of weak evidence that NMN may do something when it comes to endurance exercise. Certainly not the kind of thing that I would hang my hat on and sell a supplement based on it.
And it's an expensive supplement too, so the ROI might not be great.
Well, and if you really think that NMN is going to boost your exercise capacity, you can get niacin for 10 to 50-fold cheaper.
Yeah, just take slightly more or just a different dose. I mean, a quick question is, so he sells it at 400 milligrams per pill. The study did the, dose dependent 3, 6, 12.
Yeah.
How do they translate, what they give a mouse to what you put into a supplement for a human?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a lot of guesswork. So, and some of it is just pragmatic. It comes down to cost. Like these companies that want to sell these supplements, want to get their supplements in a price point that they think people will pay for it. So even if the right translation was 5 grams a day, nobody's going to pay, $1,000 a month for this supplement, or at least most people aren't.
Yeah.
So we're not going to put that much in it. So it's a combination of factors. Often the way this is done is there are scaling factors that you can use for prescription medications that go through the sort of canonical detoxification pathways to go from mice to dogs to humans. And you can use those tables to get to a number. But in this case, I think, given that we know these NAD precursors, if they're doing anything, their biological activity is by increasing NAD availability, and we can measure NAD availability. We can measure it in blood. I think the real question is not, do the doses translate from mice to people? It's, do we get equivalent increases in NAD levels at the doses across organisms? And that's measurable. Okay. The fact that we usually don't get that measured, I think, should tell you something about, whether or not the people selling these supplements really care if they have the right doses for what they claim they want to accomplish.
Yeah. And this is just one example of a lot of supplements out there with just 1 to 2 studies behind them that are selling and people are making a lot of money.
And, I think hopefully, as people can appreciate, the actual confidence from these studies is often much lower than what gets claimed by the people selling these supplements.
Yep. All right, Matt. Well, thank you. That was enlightening.
All right.
All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this. Please hit like, subscribe, hit the bell notifications if you want to be notified when we put out our next video. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. We'll see you next time on podcast.